And welcome back to the Financially Simple Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread, and today I'm joined by my dear friend and colleague, Mr. Jeff Jetter, who is a CFP, Certified Estate Planner. How are you, brother?
I'm doing very well, sir. How are you?
Buddy, I'm greatly blessed and highly favored. You know, it is a beautiful day in East Tennessee, and I spent some time over the weekend, Jeff, working in the garden and picking wild blackberries. Did you have an eventful weekend?
I did have an eventful weekend. We went to Dollywood, which was our first visit for my girls. So that was fantastic.
So for those of you who aren't familiar, Dollywood is like an adventure theme park kind of set up in a backcountry mountain setting up in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, actually Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, I believe. Just as an old park. It used to be, I think, the Silver City, Dollar Silver City or something like that. Does that sound right?
That may be right.
Silver Dollar City is what I think it used to be called. But hey, look, so I was thinking, you know, over the weekend we picked blackberries. What's your favorite type of jelly?
I guess for me, it's got to be strawberry, traditional strawberry jelly.
Now, do you like it, the jelly, like with no seeds in it, or do you like more of a jam type where it has chunks in it, and a little bit of seeds of the strawberries in there?
Now, I'll take the seeds. The smoother it is to spread, the better.
Okay. All right. All right. So my wife makes this mixed berries. We use like huckleberries and blackberries and black raspberries. She mixes it all together, and it's all wild, organic, except for the sugar, you know, because sugar is just sugar. But it is, Jeff, I'm telling you, it'll make your tongue slap your brains out. It's so good. It's so
That'll
good.
work for me.
So this year, Jeff, has been unusual. COVID has wreaked havoc on the small business environment. It's been amazing to watch happen. But, you know, whenever this all began, I know you and I were looking at this here in the office, dealing with clients mutually, and we were saying, what an amazing opportunity, more so than ever. In fact, it's been famously said over and over again that the Great Depression created more millionaires than any other time in history. And I got to believe that with the internet today and where our country was poised on this entrepreneurial spirit, more so than ever, going into COVID, I've got to believe that COVID is going to give us an opportunity to create a lot of wealth and a lot of opportunity for people. So whenever we see disruption, we often see great opportunity. Now, one of the things I've been tracking, as well as you with dealing with the planning side, is our interest rates have dropped. I mean, to historic lows. Right now, the Treasury is at almost 0%. I mean, there's really no yield on the Treasury, and that's causing interest rates on various types of loans to be extremely low. So for example, the PPP, which I've done a lot about, Jeff, I mean, it's got a forgiven interest rate or a 1% loan for 5 years, depending on which way you go there. The EIDL loan, which is the disaster, the economic injury disaster loan, if I can get it right, that has a 3.75 30-year interest rate. I mean, mortgages weren't that low a year ago. Now we have small business loans coming in at somewhere around sub 5, and mortgages, once again, I heard somebody the other day got it approved for a 2.65% 30-year mortgage here recently. I mean, Jeff, these are unbelievable times. And that leads us to a question of, should we use debt, or better yet, how to use leverage business debt? Now, whenever I say that, before we dive into all the technicals, I realize there's two camps, so to speak, in this avenue. You have the Dave Ramsey camp, who says avoid debt at all costs. And most of the time he's dealing with individuals who candidly cannot control their debt or end up being causing much problems. And I understand that, and we recommend that to a number of clients who have a hard time dealing with debt. But then you have Robert Kiyosaki, who's on the other side, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, who talks about using debt as leverage and how his rich dad taught him how to use debt. You know, in the professional world with like certified value growth and CPAs and certified valuation advisors, we understand that debt is cheap. The price to borrow money is cheap and thus affords us a lot of opportunity. So, Jeff, I want to have a conversation with you as the certified financial planner, the individual in our company who walks people, business owners, through on a regular basis this idea of personal planning. I want to have this conversation with you around how to use debt properly, especially in a business setting. How to create leverage out of debt. So as we peel that onion with that kind of backdrop there, as we peel that back, let's start with the basics. First of all, okay, good. What is debt?
All right. And that's a great place to start. And then we'll dig into leverage. But debt really is a promise of future assets for use of current assets. So that's a fancy way of saying what do I owe you, right? So if you provide something for me today, what do I owe in exchange for that? What assets will I have to repay? And typically when we talk about debt, that's done through contract or agreement or a mortgage loan or a note or something like that.
So, Jeff, we often see people get in trouble with just the premise of debt. I mean, I think Dave Ramsey with his I would say strong stand, extremely strong stand, almost militant stand, is applicable to the vast majority of people in our country. I firmly believe that. But whenever we flip over to the business owner world, many times we don't see that. So I know you and I have had personal challenges with debt. So I'll kind of tell you my story and I'll let you kind of share your story. So whenever I went to a major lawsuit about 7 years ago, well, it's been since 2009, it's been an unbelievable time ago. I had actually just leveraged my home. We had a paid for home that my wife and I took a home equity line of credit on that so we could take the equity out of the home. And in doing so, we also had some investment accounts. I mean, we were debt free at age, what was that, 28, 29-ish, somewhere in that time frame, pre-30. We were debt free, had a really nice house, had 6 figures of cash in the bank. But then whenever I got into the legal world, trying to start up my business and defending myself through a lawsuit, which ultimately settled, by the way, for those of you who are inquisitive minds out there, I ended up using debt to survive. I ended up using debt to build my business, but it was never so far out of hand that I couldn't recover from it. Brother, I know we've seen others who get into debt problems as well. Have you ever personally dealt with debt on a positive or negative manner?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting story and an interesting time frame. You were in a position to be able to have some capital and assets available for you, be debt free, and then use new debt to create new opportunities. Let me tell you my experience at about age 28. I had gone in the military as a very young man. I was an officer. I had money kind of wherever I needed it. I had housing. All this was provided for me. So debt was easy to come by, especially that consumer or consumptive debt. That debt that provides no real value, but provides really strong interest rates and costs associated with it. And I got myself into a little pickle at about the same age that you're talking about, that 25 to 28. I found myself in debt that I wasn't sure I'd be able to get out of, to be honest with you. And I was paying more in interest than I was for my home.
You know, it's often said by one of our colleagues, Mr. Brandon Jordan, who's also a certified financial planner. He often says financial planning protects the future Justin or the future Jeff from the present Jeff, but also, or present Justin, but also financial planning affords the present Jeff and Justin and our families or whoever's listening to this, the opportunity to live in the present without robbing from the future or vice versa, not letting the future rob from us. So whenever we talk about the debt, it's interesting you said you used the term bad debt. Okay. So I think that I know I've certainly preached this on some of the podcasts and stages that I've been on, but let's deal with this idea between good debt and bad debt. You know, some people, as we mentioned earlier, view all debt as bad debt. Others say that all debt is good debt. And I have to believe that whenever you pull the extremes in, that there is this categorization of good debt. If there is such a thing as good or acceptable debt, maybe is a better term there. And then there truly is some bad debt. So in your mind, how would you delineate between acceptable debt and bad debt?
Yeah, so often we hear these terms, especially from some political from some pundits and entertainers that talk about this good debt versus bad debt and the need for elimination of bad debt. I like to get away from those terms and talk more about productive debt, AKA good, right? Or consumptive or consumer debt. And the reason I talk in those terms instead of good versus bad is because in different industries, your CPA may talk differently. Your tax planner may talk a little differently. There are different ways to manage that debt. And sometimes you can say, well, I'll get a tax break over here. That's good debt. Not necessarily. If we can use that to our advantage, in other words, if we can put it in a productive stance, then it's productive debt or good debt. I hate to say it. If it's something that's just going to continue to consume us with interest rates, and not provide any positive value from it, that's consumptive or consumer debt, and that's bad debt.
So let's give an example then of consumptive and productive debt using your terms, or some people would recognize good versus bad, because or good versus evil, right? I mean, heroes versus, I mean, whatever term you want to use. I like your term of consumptive. You know, we often talk about the debt itself. It's actually the interest and the liability that destroys our wealth is what kills us on this. So Jeff, in your mind, and I know this is not a carte blanche. I mean, we could argue productivity on what some people would argue consumptive, but what are the most common consumptive debts out there in your mind?
Well, the biggest consumptive debt and the biggest consumer obligation we have is credit card debt, right? You can also get into some things like student loans and those sorts of things. But the biggest one that we face, especially in today's market and economy, and especially with our young folks, is this credit card debt. It is so easy to get. It is so expensive to maintain. That's the biggest one that really hurts us. And that's why we call it consumer debt.
Did you ever have the talk with your dad or mom? So the talk was not around this idea of sex. I mean, we obviously had that conversation, but it was around this idea of credit card debt. Now, back in the day, whenever I was in high school, Larry Burkett was the religious debt guru of the time. This is a little bit pre-Dave Ramsey, who kind of entered into the religious sect after kind of Larry Burkett was moving off the scenes. And I can remember my dad telling me, he said, son, credit cards will destroy your life. I mean, he put them right there with like tobacco, loose women, alcohol, everything. He's, son, this is like drugs. It literally is a drug. It will destroy your life. And then I've heard recently Mark Cuban, who, you know, a famous multi-millionaire.
Sure.
He was interviewed by none other than Dave Ramsey. And they were talking about that very thing, that credit cards will destroy your life. So does that mean, Jeff, that I should never use a credit card if it is a consumptive debt?
Of course not. There's the right time and the right place for everything. And this sort of goes back to my answer for all of your questions whenever I'm on your podcast. And that is, it depends, right? So, and again, it depends. What I can say is carrying a balance on a high interest rate obligation. Typically, credit cards are a high interest rate obligation. Whenever you're carrying a balance on a high interest rate obligation, you are being consumed by the interest. And like I said, I have personal experience with this. And you're absolutely right, Justin. It was, I'm not going to say addicting, but it was so easy. It was so easy as a young military officer to go out there and just get another credit card and go get whatever I wanted. I want it now, I'll pay for it later. And that mentality got me into a position where I was paying more in interest rate than I was paying for my food, groceries, living. I was paying more in interest, and it took some real effort to get out of that mess. That may or may not have prompted me into the financial services industry. I'm not sure.
Well, inevitably, what we're doing is we're spending tomorrow's dollars today. We're spending tomorrow's lifestyle today whenever we're using credit cards that we actually carry a balance on. We're not talking about, obviously, friends, those business owners like myself. I have 2 credit cards that I use here in the business. We use it for multiple advantages and points and pay it off every single month. There is no liability on that as far as the ongoing. Doesn't cost me anything. We're not talking, obviously, about that. We're talking about those individuals who candidly just have a hard time with debt because of shiny object syndrome, because of ultimately spending tomorrow's dollars today. It's just as dangerous. So as we shift from then consumptive debt, Jeff, what are some categories of this productive debt as you're using it?
Well, we've got a lot of opportunities for productive debt, especially as you mentioned a few minutes ago, Justin. We've got money is so cheap right now. We've got opportunities for whether it be secured or unsecured debt that are really, really cost manageable. So you're not looking at those high interest rates. You may be looking at 0%, 1%, 2%, 4%, 5%, low single digits, where you have the opportunity to take that capital, that borrowed, that shiny object dollar today, and put it to use that's going to return much more than the cost of borrowing the dollar today. We have to manage that well, though.
So let's ask the question, if we know what the debt is, good and bad, when should we utilize debt as leverage? So I think before we get into the when, let's talk about the leverage aspect of what we're dealing with. We're wanting to take dollars and leverage it. What does that mean in your terms?
Well, I always like talking about leveraging, because you hear this in the financial world all the time and it sounds very sophisticated and complicated. Really, leverage is a physical term. It's from physics, and that is the action of making a motion easier. Okay, so if you take a lever, like a seesaw, for example, if you put something very heavy on the seesaw close to the fulcrum or the point of pivot, and you go way out to the end, it doesn't take much effort at all to lift that up. You put that very heavy object way at the end, and you try to get close to the fulcrum and push that up, you're going to be struggling all day long. That ease is leverage. That is using a lever or leverage. Now, we bring that into the financial world. Do we have an investment strategy of the borrowed money to take advantage of it? Then we're leveraging our debt or leveraging our borrowed assets.
And
did I answer your question?
You did, very much so. So we're basically taking a tool, a lever, in this case it'd be debt, to manipulate or to affect something that you're going to use the lever against. So that could be net worth, it could be debt to leverage other debt, it could be inevitably you're moving something upwards, you're trying to reposition some object. So perhaps the most common tool or the common point that we're trying to affect is net worth, I would have to believe. Is that
sure? You've got net worth, you've got income streams. You can leverage debt to income. You can leverage debt to physical assets that we can use later. And of course, like you mentioned, you can leverage debt for net worth.
So when do we use debt? When do we use debt as a leverage? I mean, there has to be a time whenever it makes sense to do so.
It comes down to that cost benefit comparison. How much does it cost? What am I going to get? And if I'm getting a pair of shoes for today and I'm paying 20% interest on that, maybe I should hold off, right? But if I'm getting an asset that is going to provide an income stream at 6%, and that investment or that debt is going to cost me 4%, well, there you go. There's your productive versus consumptive. Where does it go from red to black?
So probably the most common tool of leverage is the home mortgage. People often, especially right now, use a 2.68, dude. I mean, think about it, 2.68% interest rate. I mean, it wasn't a year ago, they were 4, 5. Okay. So
we were talking about that being an all-time low.
I know, seriously, it's crazy, isn't it? So people will borrow a house, and if you take the 40-year track record of real estate, it's only like about 3.7%. Now, I realize in the last present 10 years, there have been parts of our country which has seen unbelievable growth trends. In fact, there's a huge exodus coming out of California because of the tax rates, where Idaho and Nevada are picking up some serious types of real estate booms at this point. So leverage could be where somebody was in California, hypothetically, and wanted to take and use a lot of debt to buy a house in Nevada or Idaho because of the exodus out of the California tax system. And they could end up ultimately receiving a huge benefit from the potential, not always, but from the potential real estate gain. So that's an example. You know, Jeff, one of the most dangerous examples that I see as the business advisor here working alongside of you and the rest of the planners in the company are business owners who fall victim to the sales pitch of when. And what I mean by that is they'll have somebody, let's take a dentist, for example, because they love shiny objects, right? They're high analytics. They can get real deep into the technical specificities, and they love gadgets because that industry is built around high technology gadgets. Had somebody the other day call and said, hey, Justin, I just received some cash from a loan. I really like to buy this tool because it is going to do X, Y, Z. And it was a $60,000 purchase, and they were going to leverage this using debt on this tool. And so whenever I ran the analysis with them, Jeff, it came back to where I said, unless you, and here's the raw, without getting into the actual calculation of the client, it was, unless this new piece of equipment can generate a net profit of $25,000 a year, this is not a piece that I would leverage. So whenever we look at leverage, we're looking at the opportunity, but the opportunity is sometimes hidden in between the weeds, man. How do you go about trying to, and I know this is a big question. Okay. So I'll let you take it whichever way you want to go, because this is a tough question. Whenever we're looking at leveraging debt, using debt as a leverage, we can use it for many different purposes. How do you know when you should not use debt as a leverage?
Well, the first and foremost rule of not using debt is if you can't afford the payment. So that's the first thing I want to look at. And so often we think, well, I can go out and get this loan and produce this asset or produce this income. It can generate, and using that tool example, I want this because it's going to make me more competitive in my local market. It's going to then provide some income stream because it's going to be a better tool and provide a higher income or billing structure for the office, right? But the first thing we need to look at is it a sustainable payment? Is it a debt worth taking? So that's one thing we need to look at. The next thing we always want to take a look at is, what is our short and long-term goal with this? So we wanted to, and short-term's always easier to analyze. Long-term's always more effective. So we want to take a look at the short-term goal and, okay, what are we going to do with that this year? And then in the next 2 years, before the next shiny piece of equipment attracts our eye, right? So what are we going to do with that for the next 2 or 3 years? And then what long-term effect does that have? So, and that's often where your mortgages come into play, and your commercial property and your business notes come into play, is that longer play. Whereas the equipment you're talking about is often your shorter play.
So, I mean, we could dive into some technical jargon here, friends, talking about macro versus micro, risk versus interest rates, ROI versus spreads. I mean, we could talk about all those wins, when do you employ those, and there's a right time and there's a right place. I often quote, my dad said this 1,000 times in my life, Jeff. He said, the right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing. Always. He said 1,000 times in my life. And I said, in fact, I quoted that to one of our team members the other day saying, hey, the right thing at the wrong time. It's the right thing, but it's the wrong time. It's the wrong thing right now. So then we ultimately come down to, well, okay, how or where do I go to properly use debt? And, you know, there's so many avenues of debt availability out there. If you were looking at your business, Jeff, or you were in, as you and I often do with multiple clients during the personal planning process, where do you start off with in looking for the ability to leverage debt? Is there a particular location? Is there a particular source? Where do you start in your mind's eye?
Well, you want to start with your success team, your as Brandon calls it, your financial team. Who do you know, like, and trust that you're going to talk to about these financial decisions? Because emotion is always in play here. I want those shoes, but I don't want to pay for them today. I want that shiny piece of equipment that will bring some revenue, but is it the right decision? I want that property, that commercial real estate, that business note, and leverage that money. But there's always emotion in play there. So we want to talk to somebody who doesn't necessarily have the emotional attachment and investment in the money. Your financial team. If that's us, we'd be happy to talk to you about it. So that's who you want to start with, and just go in there and say, I'm thinking about making this decision. Is this a smart decision to use debt?
And then one of the things I've noticed that in your thinking, in the way that most of our colleagues in our industry and I think candidly in our office think, is we're trying to constantly position our clients so they have multiple leverage points they can come from. So, you know, bank loans are most common if I could talk today, man, Jeff, I'm having a hard time. I probably need, I need to have the weekend all over again or something. But, bank loans are often the most popular place to go. And then we looked at, like I did, we looked at a home equity line of credit, which I believe everybody should have regardless of where they're at. Personal opinion. I think it's an opportunity that you just never know what's going to happen in life. Case in point, that many years ago, if you had asked me whenever I had a paid for house and hundreds of $1,000s in the bank that I would need my equity in my home to survive or to start a business, I would have told you you're full of it. but yet there it was. And at the time, whenever I lost, quote, that particular job, I wouldn't be able to go out and get a home equity line of credit at that point. So I believe a home equity line of credit is important. I know there's a lot of individuals who have life insurance, so they use like cash value style life insurances. I also realize that you can create margins on investment accounts. You can look at personal notes. You can look at credit cards. There's some danger with that. It's not one of my favorites. And you can actually look at loans from 401ks or investing with IRAs on alternative investments. There's a time and place for all this thing. So in your mind's eye, whenever you approach financial planning, are you looking at, you mentioned goals. Are you looking at that client who says, hey, I want to achieve X, Y, Z in the future, on how to position their finances so that they could potentially use leverage if something were to come up in the future?
Oh, without question. We always look at that. As a matter of fact, that's one of the first, what I call windows. We have 4 major windows that we look at whenever we do a personal financial planning. And as you know, we do personal financial planning with all of our business clients. One of the first windows we look at is cash flow. And a lot of people think cash flow of that evil B word, right? That we always talk about, the budget. Yes, we do look at that. We do look at budget and how we can make that more efficient. But one of the other things we really look at when it comes to cash flow is how are we using or misusing, how can we remanage or better manage our debt?
So let's apply this, Jeff. Let's go to an application. If we're trying to summarize all of this story at this point, we've looked at the possibility that, first of all, we realize that there are camps out there on the extremes who some say no debt, some say use all sorts of debt. You have right now an unbelievable opportunity because of where interest rates are. We talked about what is debt in its simplicity, and then we talked about what you defined as productive versus consumptive debt. We then looked at when to use debt as leverage, timing, cost. We looked at opportunity. We talked about where to get debt from and how to use the debt. But Jeff, how do you apply all this? What does all this mean? If you could put it into one sentence or two, how should I, as a business owner who's listening to Justin and Jeff talk about this idea of leverage debt, how should I apply this?
I can do it in one word: responsibly. And it goes back to so many things that we do. If we do it in moderation, responsibly, we're well-informed consumers of debt, then we control and we manage what we're doing with it. And if we do that, then we're in a position where the debt is a tool that we're using. If the debt is consuming us, like I mentioned, it did me in my late 20s. I got into a position where I was paying interest rates that I'd be embarrassed to talk about today. And they were 20 pluses, and I was not knowing how to manage that. It took a long time. So when the debt starts to consume us, that's bad. When we are managing and productively using this very valuable tool, I don't think there's ever a position to say debt is bad. I don't think there's ever a position to say more debt is better. Again, it comes down to moderation, like everything else, and your particular circumstance. How can we make your debt better managed for your goals?
So I think what I just heard Jeff said is debt can be, if it's used properly, can be useful. If it's used correctly, it can be useful. But if you don't use it properly, it can destroy you. It can sink your boat. It's like holding a rattlesnake. It has its place. It has lots of things in life. You say, how in the world, Justin? But it does. It provides us lots of benefit on a global scale. But man, if you touch it wrong, it will bite you and it will hurt. Jeff, as this thing's going to go live on YouTube, it's going to go on YouTube, people are going to see this idea of debt. And they're going to see this idea of, can you leverage debt? And I realize that there's certain camps out there. We've mentioned a couple of them already who just totally in avoidance. Friends, our disclaimer is this. Anytime we talk about debt or securing additional debt, it's only after, let me say it again, it's only after we've secured the cash positions that we believe, and we take an extreme cash position stance, that you should have 3 to 6 months of personal cash set back and 3 to 6 months of business cash set back, which means that a lot of our clients have $200,000-$400,000 of cash set back with significant net worth. So at this point, Jeff, the way I've always looked at debt, the way my safety net for me, and this is my personal opinion, Feel free to make it yours. This is my personal opinion. I don't mind debt, in so much that at any moment, with a stroke of a pen, I can eradicate it at any moment. And if I know I can write a check or I can sell an asset at a depressed value, notice what I just said, an asset at a depressed value. I'm not talking about selling a house at 120% of current appraised value. I'm saying let's sell my house at 50% of a current appraised value. If I can stroke a pen and walk away debt-free, man, I'm comfortable. Now that's my tolerance. Friends, you may have a different debt tolerance than what Jeff and I are even talking about. And that's okay, because he said, as he always says in my questions, it depends. It depends. So Jeff, as we sign off on this particular idea of leveraged debt, what's your last parting words on this subject?
The most important thing is do not take on any debt you can't make the payment for. Remember, any debt is an asset today that you are making a promise to return an asset later. Make sure you can return that asset.
There we go, friends. So look, I realize life is hard, life is frustrating, and life is complicated sometimes, but life is good. Life is good. I was able to pick some blackberries in the woods this week, Jeff. Didn't get bit by a snake, saw one. Didn't get bit by a snake, made some homemade blackberry jelly that I'm going to be feasting on as we're driving across country not too long from now. Man, I'm looking forward to it. So friends, I realize life is frustrating. Money doesn't have to be, and debt can rock your world. It can eat your lunch. It can knock your teeth in. Trust me, it will chew you up and spit you out.
Well,
doesn't have to. We're here to continue to make your lives at least financially simple. Until next time, Jeff and Justin signing off on behalf of the entire Financially Simple team. Go out and make it a great day.